when we got together just to plan for different sessions and what we would be doing, we really wanted to have some good takeaways for other people in ministry, and so we were talking about, hey, this book that had come out, Steve Cuss actually wrote Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs, and they had a workshop that TBC did, and I wasn't able to make the workshop, but I read the book and found out that Richard had read the book as well, and so we thought, hey, what a great thing to have a discussion about leadership anxiety, because we felt like there might be a couple of you that face that once in a while. So, yeah. So I just wanted to start by asking Richard, when he read the book, we didn't read it together, and we're just kind of comparing notes, but what is anxiety? What is leadership anxiety?
Well, it's interesting that the title itself grabbed me, because actually for me personally, just disclosure is that I've struggled with anxiety as a physical and emotional reality in my life since I was a child. And in fact now I actually in my mid-30s, late 30s, finally got a diagnosis of an anxiety and panic disorder, which is it doesn't feel real manly, like I've got this panic disorder. But and I've done lots of counseling and lots of work, and I take medication. Full disclosure again. But so when I see something about anxiety, it grabs my attention, and like, I have more than just leadership anxiety. I've got all kinds of it. I got anxiety to spare. But I think what I like about it is, I'd say the first thing that grabbed me is I began to read the book, and again, I actually am still working my way through it, but one of the things I love about what kind of a big emphasis that he said is, you've got to start with a degree of self-awareness. And I find that is a hard thing for people in general, but I think leaders struggle with self-awareness, because one, we think we are aware of ourselves. We go, I know myself. I know myself well enough. And what would be a fascinating exercise is to ask some of the people around you, like a spouse or a close friend or somebody that doesn't have, that loves you but knows you well enough, and to ask this question: how do you experience me? On a regular basis, how do you experience me? And don't get defensive, or even don't say anything. Just listen and receive what they have to say, because and this is, again, I didn't grow up in circles where the idea of looking inward very much was actually don't do too much of that. It's probably going to lead to just self-involvement, navel gazing, all that kind of stuff. But it was actually Calvin himself who said, if you don't know yourself, you can't love God or know God very well. It's not this new idea of know yourself. I mean, and so that was a kind of a big emphasis in the beginning of, like, I didn't know myself very well, and then he got thrust into some. You could talk about that. The environment he got thrown into forced a lot of stuff to the surface. Just like leading a church will bring a lot of stuff to the surface that's in there, and then you go, what? How do I deal with this?
So, not only is Steve Cuss a pastor, he actually talked about being a chaplain for emergency room chaplain at a hospital, and he got thrust into it. And one of the things they talk about in here is the gap. They talk about the anxiety gap, and the anxiety gap being what you're equipped for and what you have to face as a leader. So we're all thrown into the deep end to face things that are above and beyond our education or our background. So here is this young guy, goes through seminary, he's like, okay, I'm going to be a chaplain. And the first time he deals with someone that's dying, and like this couple is saying, our child is dying, help us. Like, how do you deal with that? He actually assisted and ministered to families through 250 deaths, through infant deaths. He was with a husband whose wife shot him with a shotgun. As he died, he was that person. And one of the things he realized was that you're never going to be equipped for everything that you go through. And part of the anxiety is just thinking, I'm not equipped for this, or I need more education, I need more background. And none of those things are bad in and of themselves to try to get. But if we ever try to get to the place where that will be the thing that takes away the anxiety, because I'm so equipped and I'm so ready, then that's just an illusion, because we are always going to be in that gap. And so a big part of the book is leading in that gap and realizing, I'm like Moses. I'm still there in that gap, and I'm not adequate. And yet, who is God to, my reliance? So.
In fact, he does a really good job, I think, of not just, he gets into, later in the book, it's really helpful. He does a really great job with unpacking in a pretty brief way family systems theory, which is really a lot about, or just systems theory, which is, we're all part of systems. Your own internal, your family. There's actually a whole new counseling deal around internal family system. Like within ourselves, there's a whole family of voices and things competing for attention. But then our churches, our staffs, people around us, they're all systems, and every system is configured with a certain amount of anxiety. And so he gets into a lot of that. But before he gets into that, he talks a lot about this, how does the gospel relate to this? Again, for me growing up at church, anxiety was like basically addressed by this: don't worry. In fact, worrying is a sin, right? To be anxious for nothing, that's a command, by the way. And so if you're breaking the command of God, then you are sinning. That's a really helpful thing to tell someone with a lot of anxiety, right? Because now I'm anxious about my anxiety, right? Because now I just have guilt and shame and all that. But what he talks about, I think at the beginning of this kind of chapter on how does the gospel relate to this, he said, leadership anxiety is generated when we think we need something in any particular moment that we don't actually need. And he's not saying that those feelings aren't real or just that's imaginary. He's saying in the gospel we have been given what we truly need: acceptance, love, a positional standing with Christ that cannot be taken away. What we actually need has been given to us. But those feelings of, well, there's this stress, there's this unhappy person, there's this situation that's happening that is making me feel really uncertain, and so we feel like I have to fix it. I have to make the anxiety level go down, and that can lead us into making poor decisions or capitulating or just reacting instead.
One of the things he talks about also is when you know yourself. There's some controversy over whether it's Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram or Strength Finders, and all of these things. He said those things aren't bad things. It's good to identify who you are, to look at your strengths, but it's not a place to camp out on. And sometimes he said that could be an excuse to say, well, I'm just, it's just who I am. I'm a 7, so I just do these things or whatever it is, So he talks about how when we preach the gospel to ourselves, that sometimes there's this anxiety that comes of being just like Jesus instead of just following Jesus. So he uses the analogy of chasing a rabbit, like in the greyhounds. They would go in dog races, they would chase this fake rabbit, but they never catch the rabbit. So he's like, what a bummer, they never catch the rabbit. And sometimes trying to be like Jesus as leaders, we always fall short because we're never going to be just like Jesus. And part of it is just following him. If we just follow him and allow Christ to be formed in us, then he forms that within us. And that was a big theological aha for me, and very practical too when I saw that, because sometimes our anxiety comes from pressure that we put on ourselves to be perfect or to be the pastoral presence in a situation. And just die to self, he says, and follow Christ, and then trust him with how he's going to use that.
Yeah. I think one of the things with it too is that, again, it's the self-awareness, but then the difference between self-awareness and self-reliance. He says, anxiety shrinks the power of the gospel because it presents a false gospel, one of self-reliance rather than reliance on God. And of course, all of us are going to say, well, of course, yes, we need to rely on God. But again, we say that, but inwardly, where do we really go? Where is my real comfort found? Where is my security found? And so when I find, and I think this is what's helpful for me, at least I found, in terms of being aware of what's inside of me. If I'm always going to be noticing things and saying, well, stop doing that, that's bad, oh, that's not good, and when that stuff comes up, can I notice without immediately judging it? Can I notice it without immediately going into self-contempt or fix it or make it better? Can I just, okay, that's coming up, and now, Jesus, I want to sit with you in that. I don't like that this is coming up, and I don't like this situation, but if I'm immediately, I have to make that feeling go away, or or beat myself up, then we just get trapped in this really ugly cycle instead of saying, okay, Jesus, how do you feel about me right now? Are you looking at me going, well, you're in anxiety again. I'm sick of you. Like, no, that's not what he's doing. So can I notice it without immediately judging it?
And that's hard. A couple of years ago, I was a part of a soul care group. Richard's been a part of that as well. That actually, my spiritual director talked about, hey, when you notice these things in yourself, just notice them. Because he always saw this judgment when I would notice them, and I'm always mad at myself. Always like, that it's kind of a carryover from kind of my childhood, how I grew up, and then in sports, like when you mess up, it's like you got to punish yourself for a while first, and then you could like get into like getting back and recovering. He's like, no, just notice those things and just say, oh, there's that part of me again, and just bring it to the Lord, and then just move on instead of like beating yourself down because you're not measuring up.
If you've been in counseling, this is a common counseling phrase: you're shoulding all over yourself. You ever heard that? I should be better. I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't think that way. I shouldn't. It's like, and again, when I do that to myself, it's like, does that help? Telling myself I should be better, and it's like, just like imagine doing that with your child. Well, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. And that's all the message they hear. Does that help them be better? It helps them be afraid. Helps them feel ashamed. It helps them, try and avoid your displeasure, but that's not the kind of relationship we want with our children, and I know that's not the kind of relationship God wants with us. He wants to invite us into something far greater, but to start to notice it, and again, he's not saying, hey, if there's sin, ignore it. Just go, well, I'm noticing that I'm off in some really horrible sin. That's interesting. It's like, no, it's not that.
Right.
Okay, so to be clear, but it's not excusing. But it's starting from a place of, can I be with Jesus in it and ask, what does he want to say to me about it? As opposed to, I'm going to fix myself, Jesus, and earn your approval. If I am already approved in Christ in the gospel, if I already am there, and that is what the gospel says, then I move from a place of acceptance and belovedness, and I can follow Christ where he leads me, as opposed to, I have to do better or Jesus won't accept me. It's very different.
So the first part of the book, I love that it goes from internal anxiety and how we go through anxiety within ourselves, but then the second part, yours and theirs. So before he gets into dealing with anxiety as far as interpersonal relationships and in ministry and in leadership, he talks about idolatry. He talks about like the stories that we tell ourselves. So Richard, maybe you could share a little bit about what he means by idolatry.
Well, idolatry, Tim Keller did an amazing job with this. I think has done a lot to help, frame the conversation, because in our culture today, the idea of sin is actually just a very foreign word to people, or it's an ancient word. Like, well, I don't relate to that. And so Tim, I think, did a great job in saying, okay, idolatry, anything that you think you need, that becomes a good thing, even that becomes an ultimate thing. A good thing that becomes, I have to have this in order to be whole or okay. And so an idolatry, and you could talk more about how he describes this, but it's if I'm making a situation like it needs to be a certain way, an outcome be a certain way, or even feeling a certain way, all those things can become an idol. And it's not something we're literally bowing down to. It's something that we are investing with a weight or an expectation that it can't hold ultimately, and so it will fail us. But it also leads us away from actually his thing is he talks about is my dependence on God or that thing, that even if that idol might not be a bad thing. It could be a sense of peace or security, or wanting relationships to be okay. That's not a bad thing. But when I say that becomes the what I have to have for things to be okay, then it can become an idol, as opposed to, God, I'm going to rely on you for what you want to bring in this situation.
Yeah, that's great. Then he moves from there, so the gospel informs our own internal anxiety. I love how he goes from personal, and then he starts to go like, how does this look in a group setting? So if you're managing, you're leading, you're with other people. One of the things he talked about, which I loved, he talked about sources of relational anxiety. Then he gives different examples, so it's really practical. One of them is mixed messages. So when you have someone on your team that says one thing, but they say it sarcastically, or you could tell, like they'll say, okay, I'll do that, but there's like this other hidden message. So how do you deal with that? Real practical, he said, just like Bobby Kennedy did with the Russians in the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the Russians had sent over 2 different communiques that said, we're okay with you or we're going to bomb you. Like these 2 things. And like, we just got these 12 hours apart. What do we do? And Bobby Kennedy said, hey, let's ignore the second one and let's just say thank you for, being peaceful, and let's just hold on to the first one. And then we'll see what happens. And so he talks about doing that. Like if someone gives a mixed message, ignore the mixed part of it and just hold on to the part that's the positive, or confront the other part and say, are you really saying that, but you mean this? Because what it does is it transfers the onus of that mixed message back to the person that's communicating. So no longer is the stress sitting in you. How do I interpret this? What do I do in this situation? You just put it right back on the person by either ignoring the negative thing, and they're going like, he didn't get my jab. Like I tried to jab him and he's not getting it. Or you address the jab so that you say, are you really meaning this? And now it's put back on them to be clear. So that's just one of the practical things relationally that was very helpful.
Do the other one that you talked to me about earlier.
Another one is called phantom strikes. Listen to this sentence. A phantom strike is any time one person takes a shot at you, but she's carrying a hidden army with her. It is any variation of me and a bunch of people who aren't here, and I won't name, all think there's something wrong with you. So
I know that none of you have ever had that happen, but and you know what is it when someone says, like either a bunch of us were talking, usually that means what? 1 or 2 or nobody. Maybe they made it up. And even if it was a bunch of people, it's like you want to immediately go, well, that was wrong. That doesn't usually help, but how does he talk about addressing that?
So he just says, hey, when that happens, just say, well, I would really like to find out who those, but not because I'm trying to chase down everything, but I want to know relationally, and you just bring it right back to the person. Say, it's going to make it really difficult for me to feel like I'm around a bunch of people and I don't know who these people are that you're talking about, and that's really not fair. So you bring that out rather than just sitting with it and go, man, I'm living in this tension, and I go to church and I'm looking around like, who is it? I'm sure it's that person because they didn't say hi to me. And then we play all these head trips. It's like, bring it right out. And a lot of these, we're not going to go into all of them, but a lot of those things are just being honest in communication and not letting someone manipulate you into that place of anxiety where they have this hidden knowledge over you that they're hanging over your head.
So much of it I find in many of these situations is honestly just is asking questions and asking good questions. So like when you say that, what do you mean by that? Or when you help me understand, and I try and use that phrase a lot, help me understand what you mean when you're saying this. And again, it's putting in a sense the burden of communication on them, and you're trying to listen and understand, but it's not we take on sometimes I got to try and interpret, understand, make sense of all the messages you're sending me. Like, no, I want to ask questions and clarify. I think underneath one of the big things that he gets at that I think it just is it's how we relate to the systems we're in. And he uses a term that's that's just called differentiation. And you may be familiar with that term, but it's basically this. And he uses these contrasts. So I can either be differentiated from a group. Doesn't mean I'm disconnected. So there's differentiated, there's enmeshed, and then there's disconnected. So differentiated means I'm able to be, if I'm doing my work, if you will, if I'm staying connected to Jesus and rooted in the gospel, I can be okay. I can be okay in my peace. Internal peace is not dependent on this group being okay with me or approving of me or having no tension. I mean, it doesn't mean that I don't care about it, and I may even have anxiety coming up, but I'm not going to just react to my anxiety. I'm going to be aware of it, and so I'm differentiated from the group. And meshed is my inner barometer goes up and down with however the group is relating to me. If everybody's happy with me, okay, I can breathe. If they're not, or if there's tension, then I have to fix it. And so I become enmeshed in that group in an unhealthy way where I can only be okay to the degree that the group is doing right or what I think it should do. The other is, and you may be one of these. I've been around some guys or people that are like they're just able to I used to really admire people that were like, things happen in the church and they just don't seem to be bothered by it. And that can be healthy, but there's also the part that's just disconnected. It's like, I don't care, you know? I mean, they don't say that maybe, but they're like, I'm so autonomous over here that whatever happens with you people. And I would say that doesn't fit the profile of a shepherd who cares about a sheep, who enters in relationally, but it's differentiated, not disconnected. Does that make sense? So it does take work. I would just say it does take work to be aware of what's coming up in me and pay attention to that, and then I gotta take that to Jesus and be doing work, and maybe even work it out, maybe in some counseling with a friend, talk that out, kind of become aware of that, and then to be able to say, well, what does this system need actually? What would be healthy for my staff, my team, this group I'm leading, my family? What does it need, even if it's not something that I am drawn to? And it's more like, I mean, I don't know how many of you are like, man, I love confrontation. That is just my favorite. Let's do that.
Spiritual gift.
Yeah, I mean, and be worried about somebody that likes it, right? I used to know people like, oh, let's get it on. And I'm like, wow, you're a jerk. Okay, but so I don't like it, but it's necessary. And we've had to even work with our team a lot on staff and say, like, conflict is not a bad word. Conflict is necessary. Now, we can do conflict poorly and get siloed and angry, and so we need to maybe even establish some ground rules for how we're going to do conflict when we have it. But we've got to be willing to have the conversations that we need to have. I remember something a counselor said to me a number of years ago, and he was talking about my extended family dynamics. And she said, oh, so that's one of those deals where we don't talk about it, and we don't talk about what we don't talk about. I thought that was really helpful. It's like, no, we don't, your dad and how he relates to the family, we don't talk about that. And we don't talk about the fact that we don't talk about that. And that's an example of a system that is configured to protect certain things. And you probably in your staff or families like, oh, we're going to protect, we're not going to talk about this. Everybody knows this is a problem. Everybody knows this is an issue, but we're not talking about it because that will rock the boat. We know how that will go. And he talks about being able to be differentiated allows you to enter into that and have conversations that are hard, but that your internal well-being is not dependent on if this all goes really well and everybody approves of me.
And it's great. He uses Jesus as that greatest example of that. I mean, Jesus confronts things in his disciples. They're arguing over something and he'll talk about it, but he still loves them. It's not like he calls them out and then ignores them and like, okay, I'm never using you again, Peter. Like, you had a chance, but that's it. There's always like he speaks truth, but then he's able to continue on in relational connectedness with them. But his own identity doesn't come from how his followers or even his disciples are thinking about him, because he's connected to the Father. So, one of the ways, maybe we'll close with this, one of the ways in those systems that are broken, he said the more authority that you have, or the higher you are in position, the more influence you have to change the health for the better or worse of the system that you're in. So a lead pastor, for example, can really make it very unhealthy as far as the environment and being open and transparent, or can make it very healthy. So one of the things he talks about, and I love it because it's like grace kind of breaks through some of this along with transparency. He said, fortunately for our staff, their lead pastor is the chief mistake maker in residence. And I'm not shy about sharing my mistakes. They aren't pretty mistakes either. Some of them are downright cringeworthy. So when he makes a mistake, he'll be able to say, or when someone calls him out on it, hey man, I'm really sorry. I totally messed that up. And I could see how you would feel that way, or even amongst staff. And it gives people, in a sense, the sense that it's okay to be able to share those things, because otherwise everyone's going to hide their junk because they don't want anyone else to know. So it's a scary thing, but you lead by example in that. So
I would say he talks about this, and I'll use the word differentiation again, but I'll just say it's about managing your own anxiety and being aware of the contagious anxiety of a group while staying relationally connected to that group. He actually just talks a lot about it's about courage. I used to feel like that the opposite of anxiety would be peace. Like I'm at peace. And I actually think that the counterbalance to anxiety is actually courage, because anxiety may not dissipate internally. Sometimes it will, but it's going to go up and down in your journey. I know it is for me, and so it's not about saying, well, I will act when my anxiety is gone, or it's more about, give me the courage and trust in you, Jesus, to act in the way that you want me to act, to move in the way you want me to move, regardless of how I'm feeling at the moment. I'm going to bring all those fears to you, but I'm going to act, and that may be to speak courageously, maybe to engage a conversation, but how do I do that in a way that is humble and honest? I can own my own stuff and share my own stuff, but also say, let's talk about this without shaming or blaming and all that kind of stuff. How can we talk about these kinds of things together in a way that is going to lead to greater connection and connectivity and wholeness?